All right, everybody. So, you've had a chance to think about the market structure of your firms, and you've had some pretty specific questions on how to argue what the market structure might be. But the next question becomes, well, how did that come about? And by and large, something that kind of gets not necessarily covered too much in economics is historical analysis. But for the sake of a business school, an economic analysis must include some type of historical analysis. History is going to be shaping the marketplace. History is going to be shaping the factors of demand. History is going to be shaping what even determined the product or service that's being provided in the first place. Now, the purpose of this analysis is to really ask a few questions. What are the things that give these firms or your group as a whole a competitive advantage that might or has been sustainable? Your job is to point out those historical events, argue whether they are sustainable, or maybe even have to argue that they have been sustainable, but conditions have changed, and now these firms are either going to have to evolve or reconsider their position. So, just a few thoughts today to help guide your task of this historical analysis. Expectations for the paper. This really only needs to be a 1 to 2 page component. What you're trying to do here is be extremely specific. You are not trying to create a timeline. You are not trying to discuss every single event that you find as these firms have evolved through time. What are kind of more recent things, 30, 40 years? If you have to go back to their beginning, maybe 100 years ago, it better be very significant as to something that has put them in this position today. But what are the things that are very specific today that give them a competitive edge? Let's go through a few examples and a bit more clarification. Okay, so I've given you an opening example here. Take consideration of Crayola, right? You think, oh yeah, just a crayon company, but they have been around for a long time and essentially are the dominant producer of crayons. But that is not the only thing that they now do, and they've had to evolve to remain in that market. So if you could maybe pause this and take a look at that Crayola clip. It's a basic historical timeline of the evolution of this company. But for your first take at historical analysis, see if you can pinpoint a few things that you believe have contributed to their competitive edge today. I think you are definitely going to notice there is one thing that stands out. Early market development, as you can see in the slide, their ability to have certain patents on colors, their ability to have secret recipes for the way those products are created. Notice they don't just produce crayons anymore. And also further, pretty important has been their strategic relationships, specifically with education. So these are things that have put them in a position and led them to be in the place they are now. You might also even notice there's a local component to this here in Kansas City. They're now owned by the Hallmark Corporation. So, would any of these things in your mind contribute to their competitive advantage? And then looking at, say, their competitors, Rosart might be one of them. I think they may even own them right now. But look at their competitors and see what went wrong with them. How has this market changed? Okay, so this is again the point of this analysis. It is not a timeline. It is something trying to identify how this market has evolved, how these firms have evolved, and whether they can maintain this position. So, what part of history matters for their competitive position? Has it given them a competitive advantage? And is this a sustained competitive advantage for market profitability? Meaning they have something that cannot be replicated by a competitor or a new rival. What part of history has put them in their position? What part of history matters today? And will these characteristics help them, or in some cases, as you'll see in a few examples in this presentation, maybe hindering them as they move forward? So clearly we need to talk about what we mean by history here. It is not simply just the record of the past. You have to realize that, and I'm sure you do, that history is so much more than just a record. It is what we are today. We are in a living history, so to speak. It is the rules, the values, the interactions, the experiences, knowledge, technology, problems, errors we've made, and it is basically our technical know-how of how to live today. So much so, this is also the case for the business enterprise. If we needed to get even further into consideration of history, it's also how we pass information on from one generation to the next. So it's malleable. And related to business, it's the rules of the game, it's the ingredients. So, again, if you're thinking about your strategic group, have they influenced the rules of the game to be in their favor? Or has the rules of the game contributed to their failure? Something you would want to consider. Now, even the bounds of the size of business can be shaped by history. So, if we look into economic history of the United States, something that you'll find in the first chapter of your text, you're going to see pretty quickly that what has been accepted in terms of the appropriate size of business has even changed. Our love-hate relationship, say, with monopoly structures or too much power in any marketplace, that's changed generation by generation. Most of the firms that I have assigned to your groups are fairly, they're pretty much characterized by conglomerates. So they own a lot of different products and services all at the same time. Now, this wasn't just by chance. The United States had a war on monopoly structures and submitted a lot of antitrust cases. One way to avoid an antitrust case and continue to make giant profits is to diversify into lots of different marketplaces. Be not one thing, but be many things all at the same time. So much of the industrial and economic landscape that we see today, particularly in the United States, was shaped by the mergers and acquisition trends that occurred in around the 1970s and 1980s, really taking off in the 80s. So history has shaped how big can a firm be? How concentrated can an industry be? Um, if there's a point of competition that seems to help the consumer, what is the acceptable level of competition? Can competition be harmful in some cases? So these are all going to be matters that are shaped in current time to then set the stage for the future. Something you may want to consider as you look at your group. One big one is sometimes is it you may need to consider can your firm even leave? Has history shaped the conditions for your businesses to simply be in a domestic market rather than an international market? Again, big questions, but we're going to try to make it more specific so that you don't get lost in all these details. So getting started, all right? I know I've said don't create a timeline, but one thing that you can do just to start to think about, okay, who are my firms? Where did they come from? Every giant corporation has a firm history page. Now, they'll tell you things like when and why did it start, and they'll kind of tell you the initial entrepreneurial spirit. They'll tell you about all of their successes. Generally, they don't tell you their failures. And it's your job to kind of say, okay, this is where I'm going to begin. This is not going to be the last place that I go, but what what has uh, what has shaped these firms' competitive position by just looking at this basic analysis? So, if you looked at this list, what things really stick out to you as things that would contribute to profits? Now, a word of caution, okay? It's going to provide this timeline. This is not what you want to replicate for your paper. I would be fine with you citing this web page maybe one or two times, but it is not really acceptable to just have, you know, reference after reference after reference to generalelectric.com. You really need to go beyond this and try to find historical events that matter. So that's where those financial news and Business Weekly magazines and things like this will be very helpful. Forbes and Bloomberg. Um, because a corporation or a business is going to tell you the things that make them look in the best light. They're also not going to tell you their recipe. They're not going to tell you their strategy. You're not going to be able to find that embedded on that page because that would provide a competitive edge to their rivals. So why would they give away their secrets? But this is the task. You need to find information that you feel is critical to an understanding of how these firms ended up in the position they are. You're trying to explain profitability. That's what a competitive analysis does. So far, you've said the market structure contributes to profitability. This section is going to say their historical circumstances contribute to profitability. Let's do a quick example. Well, hopefully you're watching this after 5 o'clock and it's time to think about beer. Not all of you, I understand, but it is a fascinating industry because it has evolved so much and so quickly in the last 20 years. As an economist, it's a fascinating industry to study because it's reaching peaks and it's reaching critical points. And to see how this plays out and to see how firms have changed, again, it's just kind of a fascinating thing to watch. So, all right, what would we glean out of all this information that I'm about to provide you? Okay, so we'll go back to 1810. Lots of breweries in the United States. Okay, not really. Most people are still producing beer at home. What starts to shape the beer industry? Again, if you were studying, say, Boulevard Founders or some other local kind of, I guess, regional brewery, would it matter that German citizens came to the United States and really started producing a lot of beer? Does that matter today? Arguably not. The fact is, beer is here. Beer is going to be here. So, would I really need to talk about Germans? Only unless it was a niche market today and they felt that they were a brewery that was trying to edge its way into maybe a area that hasn't been played out in a while. German brewers. Okay, so we move forward. 1873. Now we have this explosion in beer. 4,000 breweries. Okay, does it matter? It means that now beer is part of the United States culture. It's going to be embedded there for sure. What happens? Okay, then we have that thing. It's called, yes, prohibition. Now, this one might actually matter as kind of a starting point because this is where you would begin to look at, well, how did the beer industry change after prohibition? This is where you start to see the emergence of what will become the market dominators. Anheuser-Busch, you could guess, some of those other German breweries, but this is the story to be told. Now, does it matter? You're most likely not going to be looking at AB InBev. They own everything else other than when we get to the craft revolution in the United States. That would most likely be the breweries you would be considering here. AB InBev is the dominant brewer in the world. They don't really have much competition because they bought it out. So doing a competitive analysis on a one firm industry by and large doesn't really tell us much. It'd be pretty hard to compete with them. Now, that is an interesting point, though, because while they are the dominant firm, there is still something to be filled in the United States and now a world market. People not wanting those brands. They want that local feel, they want that local flavor. So where does craft begin? A few companies. People are home brewing, but people still haven't caught on. Then it happens almost in this mad rush. Here are the players that will then become the dominant firms in the beer industry, particularly in the craft beer industry, for the next 30 years. There you go. There's Boulevard, 1989, Sierra Nevada, 1981, Sam Adams. It's all at the same time. Now the playing field has set. Interestingly enough, we go from these few firms in the 1980s to, yes, 2015, 4,000 plus breweries. And today, over 6,000 breweries. 2018, 8,000 breweries. I actually have some data here we can look at from the Craft Brewers Association showing the growth of these type of businesses. Brew pubs, microbreweries, regional craft breweries. The explosion is absolutely phenomenal. Now, what do we need to get from this? Say we were studying those top breweries, Sierra Nevada, Boulevard, or Sam Adams. Okay, we have to ask this. Is history on the side of these firms? You have this giant dominant market player, AB InBev, and then you have these smaller firms. Will they be able to survive? What things have they done to put themselves in a position so that they do survive? Are they single owned? Have they sold out to a conglomerate? Have they changed any of their recipes or product line? Have they tried to shape culture to be on their side? These are the type of things that you would want to point out as historical components that matter and will matter going forward. Okay, so are these things replicable? Okay, the things that you're pointing out, can other competitors see them? Can they mock them and then essentially erode any competitive position? So you need to see how these factors have contributed to this position. Try to argue that they are very difficult to replicate. This will tie directly into the notion of a core competency or a competitive advantage. Okay, so I've set up a discussion board for you in each of your groups. What you need to do is start to discuss these events. Okay, your annotated bibliography is fairly simple. You need to take some of these events that you find, cite them in APA, and then have a short discussion of what you found in that reference for you to share with the group. I mean, you're being graded on it for your individual contribution, but the point is that this will be a group contribution. So go ahead, five to 10 major events or characteristics, things that you believe that you're going to argue are not replicable, that are easily replicable. Okay, how have these events conditioned the group and the firm's existence? Okay, so it sounds like a lot, but really the purpose that what you're really trying to accomplish here is beginning to construct a story of why you believe this group's position is the way it is. And I have a kind of a helpful thought for you as you move forward now. You're trying to look at this from a couple of different lenses. One, if you were internal to the group, what would you do or what would you want to know about your group to maintain your position? And two, if you were going to be a new entrant, for example, what would you want to know about this industry or these groups so that you don't face stiff competition from these firms, somehow can isolate yourself and exist in your own little world, if by chance the major players are somewhere so far beyond your possibility of revenue or profitability? How will you find your spot? So those are the two different lenses. You have to start to think outside of your consumer brain and start to think as a producer, or as I like to tell all my students, as a graduate in business administration. So go ahead, start that discussion board, start your annotated bibliographies. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. My grading of these annotated bibliographies are going to be for thoroughness, making sure that you have 3 to 5 references, that you are contributing to the group. So not going to be like, soul crushing here. What I'm trying to do is make sure that you stay on task. Okay, I will talk to you soon.